Yes. Isn't that what we want to be?
Just letting everyone know that your words are
Oda Vinu Chai.
No.
Great. Well, we'll just give everyone a minute to get settled for everything to turn itself on in the ways that it needs to.
And we're going to have a brand new introduction.
I've been working for seconds on it. Oh, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. We're incredibly excited to have you join us for what is the final of our 5 sessions, although I think I speak for everyone when I say probably not the last of the times that we will be gathering and doing this. So it's been a great pleasure, and we love having all of you here with us and love the chance to really think about some of these profound questions that I think really drive all of us. The sessions are being recorded. They will be available afterwards on Facebook and on YouTube. We will also share the links to the recordings and any links to materials that we reference via email to anyone who is registered for the Zoom. If you want a copy of the materials but you're not registered on the Zoom, you can feel free to email me at rpickerniece@jcrcstl.org. Even though this is an intimate conversation amongst the 4 of us, we are, of course, aware that you're here, even if we can't see you, and we welcome you to join the conversation. You can ask questions via the Q&A feature or participate in the discussion in the chat. We will be peering at the chat throughout the session, and we will try to incorporate your questions and comments as much as possible. If you are watching this on Facebook and you want to submit a question or a comment, or if you would like the link to the Zoom, you can email autumn@centralreform.org. Autumn is also available to help with any technological issues and has just been awesome at driving so much of this. So we're deeply grateful to Autumn for all of their help throughout. We're also grateful to our institutions that have supported us and allowed us to come together in this space: Congregation Sheremeth, Central Reform Congregation, the Jewish Community Relations Council of St. Louis, and Congregation B'nai Emunah. We are also grateful to the Jewish Federation's Shema Listen series for co-sponsoring this program. And most of all, we're grateful to the Shalom Hartman Institute, where each of us have had the privilege to be fellows, which has provided each of us with the learning to ground these discussions, with the space to be challenged on these questions, and with the model of how a love of Jewish people can be the underpinning of even the most challenging debate. And with that, we'll get started.
Thanks, everybody. Can you hear me well? We're good? Fantastic. Actually, we want to start with something wonderful. I want to wish a mazal tov to Rabbi Jim and Amy Bennett on the engagement of their son, Ethan, b'sha'a tova. So, siman tov and mazel tov, odi shama b'arei Yehuda. Thank you. We're looking forward to celebrating. We can't hear you, Rabbi, when you respond.
Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you so much. It's a great simcha.
Rori, Maharat, Rori mentioned that we're going to refer to one another by first name, so we'll do our best to do that, and we'll keep it informal. I'm delighted today to be sharing this session on nationalism along with our colleagues here, and I'm going to ask Rabbi Bogard, who's sort of become our, I don't know, the angel, the Lord of hosts, maybe, not just a Zoom angel, but the Lord of hosts, to share the material that I'd like to share with us today. I'm going to get started by, we're going to get started by sharing a couple of short YouTubes. Part of the reason I want to do that is I want to make sure that you have a little bit of a background in the conversation that we're going to try to have together, which is on nationalism and the challenges and dangers and opportunities of nationalism. And not only a nationalism in terms of how it relates to us here in the United States, outside the land of Israel, particularly how this influences the way in which we think about our relationship with the state of Israel. And remember, that's the undergirding, right? This is what draws us all together in this conversation about how we, as contemporary Jews, living as we do in the diaspora, relate to what's going on in the place that, at least for me, is the heart of my Jewish experience, where Eretz Yisrael, Medinat Yisrael, is such an important part of my definition. And because we love Israel so much, that's why we want to have these conversations. And because we filter that through our experiences in the diaspora, particularly here in North America, it's important for us to share the thoughts and feelings, those things that are weighing on our hearts, I don't say heavily on our hearts. I think they're weighing on our hearts because it's love, and love can be a heavy thing. Like in the 60s, you say heavy. At least that's what my parents told me. So it's heavy. It's heavy. It's worthwhile. It's weighty. I used to have a teacher in yeshiva. Whenever he would have a beautiful book, a new book, he would hold it in his hand like a newborn baby and say, "Mamish, this is heavy. Like, this is heavy. This is heavy stuff," right? And so this is heavy stuff. And we're going to get started with a little bit of television, okay? A couple of YouTubes. And what I'm going to ask you to do is just listen to the YouTubes, watch them. It may be as much as 8 or 9 minutes total, okay? But I think it's worthwhile to let this kind of wash over you, and then we'll have a chance to reflect, react, and hopefully begin the conversation in earnest. But a little bit of TV. Here we go.
Nationalism is a range of political, social, and economic systems characterized by promoting the interests of a particular nation or ethnic group, mainly with the aim of gaining and maintaining self-governance or full sovereignty over the group's homeland. The political ideology, therefore, holds that link to the concept of self-determination. A nation should govern itself, free from unwanted outside interference. Nationalism is further oriented towards developing and maintaining a national identity based on shared characteristics such as culture, language, race, religion, political goals, or a belief in a common ancestry. It often also involves a sense of pride in the nation's achievements and is closely linked to the concept of patriotism. In these terms, nationalism can be considered positive or negative. In some cases, nationalism referred to the belief that a nation should be able to control the government and all means of production. The word nation was used before 1800s in Europe to refer to the inhabitants of a country as well as to collective identities that could include shared history, law, language, political rights, religion, and traditions, in a sense more akin to the modern conception. Nationalism is the newer word. In English, the term dates from 1844, although the concept is older. It became important in the 19th century, becoming increasingly negative in its connotations after 1914. It's the term historians use to characterize the modern sense of national political autonomy and self-determination from the late 18th century onwards. Typically, historians of nationalism in Europe begin with the French Revolution, not only for its impact on French nationalism, but even more for its impact on Germans and Italians and on European intellectuals. The early emergence of a popular patriotic nationalism took place in the mid-18th century and was actively promoted by the British government and by the writers and intellectuals of the time. Critics of nationalism have argued that it is often unclear what constitutes a nation or whether a nation is a legitimate unit of political rule. Nationalists hold that the boundaries of a nation and a state should coincide with one another. Thus, nationalism tends to oppose multiculturalism. It also can lead to conflict when more than one national group finds itself claiming rights to a particular territory or seeking to take control of the state. Always remember, patriotism is when love of your own people comes first, nationalism when hate for people other than your own comes first. I have some big news here at Get Wisdom channel.
Okay, I think we can go to the next one, Daniel. Okay, nationalism. We got that? By the way, I love the fact that it was a woman with an accent who shared this. And the word she said was akin. Yes, it was an interesting word, but I hope that the rest of you found that kind of interesting as well. There were lots of pieces that I could have chosen. I chose that one. Somehow or another, her accent just caught me and made me want to make sure that we heard it from a different kind of voice and a different kind of way. Okay, that is nationalism. Now we're going to go to something a little different. Watch the nuance. It's been already alluded to, but here's the next move we're going to take. Ultra-nationalism.
Ultranationalism is an extreme nationalism that promotes the interest of one state or people above all others, or simply extreme devotion to one's own nation. Ultranationalism combined with the notion of national rebirth is a key foundation of fascism. Roger Griffin asserts that ultranationalism is essentially racist and is known to legitimize itself through deeply mythicized narratives of past cultural or political periods of historical greatness, or of old scores to settle against alleged enemies. It can also draw on vulgarized forms of physical anthropology, genetics and eugenics to rationalize ideas of national superiority and destiny, of degeneracy and subhumanness.
Now we're going to talk a little bit about patriotism. You may recognize the next face, not the one of Rabbi Bogard, but the one that's coming after Rabbi Bogard, as Dan Rather.
One of the things that I deal with in the book, and one of the things we've talked about before, but sort of bears repeated, I think, that, patriotism is sometimes confused, too often confused, if you will, with nationalism, or even worse, sometimes confused with nativism, or even tribalism. It's important not to confuse patriotism with nationalism. You can be both, but I find many people get confused. They use the words interchangeably. Look it up in the dictionary if you like. As I define it, nationalism is a monologue in which you place your country in a position of moral and cultural supremacy over others. Patriotism, while deeply personal, is a dialogue with your fellow citizens and a larger world. Let me repeat that. Patriotism is a dialogue with your fellow citizens and a larger world about not only what you love about your country, but also how it can be improved, how the country can be improved. Unchecked nationalism, it has led historically to conflict and war. Unbridled patriotism can lead to the betterment of society. Patriotism is rooted in humility. Nationalism, in its worst form, is rooted in arrogance and conceit.
And finally,
Rabbi,
Yep, I got back. And now finally, we'll take a look at the difference between these notions of patriotism and ultranationalism leading to fascism. We've talked about it a little bit briefly, but I think this last video kind of lays it out for us. So I hope you're seeing the moves, right? Nationalism, ultranationalism, patriotism, and now the distinction between these two as steps in a process to have the conversation about nationalism and how we, as Jews living in the diaspora who love Israel, can relate to that challenge in the land, in the state of Israel in modern times.
Hey, it's Dan Zimmerman. Welcome to Illustrate to Educate. Don't forget to subscribe for weekly, objective videos on topics that matter. Have you ever wondered, what is the difference between patriotism and nationalism? In this video, we will look at the essential differences between these two. Let's take a brief look at the history of the two words and where they originated. Patriotism is the older of the two words, with written evidence dating back to around 1653. The word patriot itself could even be traced back further to the Greek word patrios, meaning of one's father. There isn't much evidence of nationalism occurring until just before the 19th century, almost 150 years after patriotism. And in its early use, and for a number of decades, nationalism appears to have been largely interchangeable with patriotism. However, in the 19th century and up until today, nationalism has changed meaning, while the meaning of patriotism has remained largely unchanged. Now, let's look at how they're defined. Patriotism is the feeling of love for one's country, along with the feeling of unity with those who share those feelings. It has also been defined as devoted love, support, and defense of one's country. Nationalism, on the other hand, is defined as loyalty and devotion to a nation. But the definition of nationalism also includes exalting one's nation above all others and placing primary emphasis on promotion of its culture and interests as opposed to those of other nations. Others have defined it as the policy or doctrine of asserting the interests of one's own nation viewed as separate from the interests of other nations or the common interests of all nations. Now that we've defined them, how do we compare them with each other? The difference between the two words is largely debated, and even today there's not an official consensus among scholars and social scientists. Some attribute that the feelings of patriotism are based on the positive values the country embraces, like freedom, justice, equality, bravery, value, and devotion. With patriotism, one believes that both the system of government and the people of their country are inherently good and work together for a better quality of life. In contrast, feelings of nationalism are based on a belief that one's country is superior to all others. It can often carry the connotation of distrust or disapproval of other countries, leading to the assumption that other countries are rivals. Nationalism tends to find itself modified by movements of political interest. One outlook by Sidney J. Harris says, "The difference between patriotism and nationalism is the patriot is proud of his country for what it does, and the nationalist is proud of his country no matter what it does." So how do we use patriotism and nationalism today? When using these words, it's important to keep context and connotation in mind. Patriotism generally has a positive connotation. It's used for various positive sentiments, attitudes, and actions involving loving one's country and serving the greater good of all its people. Where nationalism generally has a negative connotation, it's used for political ideologies and movements that have a more extreme and exclusionary love of one's country, at the expense of foreigners, immigrants, and even people in a country who aren't believed to belong in some way, often on racial and religious grounds. Right now, you might be thinking, nationalism just sounds like it's always bad. So is that true? Is nationalism always bad? According to some people, not always. Nationalism has its uses as a very strong motivator for uniting people together in the struggle against injustice. It has driven independence movements, like the Zionist movement that created modern Israel. Some political analysts feel that the peace in the Middle East can only be achieved through a strong national identity of the countries involved, as opposed to the current tribal and religious identities that divide them. Embracing national identities over religion may make it easier to negotiate through national, amenable laws rather than ambiguous religious laws. Did you enjoy this video comparing patriotism and nationalism?
Thank you, Daniel. I hope this lays a foundation for us to begin our conversation. So I'm going to ask that the next slide be put up, and I'm going to share with you what it is that we hope to accomplish today. And then I'm going to give my colleagues an opportunity maybe just to say a word or two about their initial impressions based on the videos. Why are we even talking about nationalism? That's the question, right? We just saw these videos and maybe we say, well, of course we are not these kinds of folks, right? The debate around nationalism is a critical debate, which will impact the viability of Jewish peoplehood and Jewish unity. Jewish peoplehood and Jewish unity, because the way in which we address the issues of nationalism will define how we as Jewish people the world over relate to the state of Israel. Israel and Zionism are intimately connected to the idea of nationalism, with Israel defining itself as the nation state of the Jewish people. If Israeli Jews are principally nationalists and many North American Jews reject that category altogether, we face a schism of potentially monumental and irreconcilable proportions. In other words, if Israeli Jews are constantly seeing themselves as nationalists, and we as Jews living outside the land of Israel see ourselves as anti-nationalist, then we're headed for a train wreck, the proportions of which I think are no less than the fissuring and fracturing of the unity or potential unity of the Jewish people. And by the way, it's a fraught unity. This session will explore whether nationalism itself is necessary, inherently corrupt, or whether it is a category that is often abused by ultranationalists. Daniel, if we could stop sharing for a moment, and maybe we can put all of us back on the screen so we can see each other. And I just want to pause for a moment to give the colleagues an opportunity to react to what you've seen so far, and then we'll go from there. Please, who would like to go first?
I'm happy to. There's an interesting distinction that I saw in doing some research for this that I felt was really helpful for me between civic nationalism and ethno-nationalism also. Understanding ethno-nationalism as being a home for a particular ethnic or religious group or people with a shared common mythology is kind of the idea, right? The story. Whereas civic nationalism is based on an idea. And it strikes me that, right, like in an American context, I think today, so many on the left side of the political schism imagine America or desire America to be, or used to imagine America as a civic nationalist project around a set of shared post-Enlightenment values. And the Republican Party of today is a white nationalist organization wanting to see America as a white ethno-state. But with Israel, it strikes me that the real tension is Israel an ethno-nationalist state for the Jewish people, or is it a state for the people of Israel, for the Israeli people? And those are different groups with deep problematics on either definition. So that's my reflection. Thank you for these videos.
I'll jump in and share a slightly different angle. Daniel, I agree with you entirely. And Carnie, I think it was really brilliant to kind of present this spectrum of perspectives on the different terms that we use. I'm coming at this right now from a very different personal perspective. I'm thinking back on my own life journey over the last 60 plus years. I was born into and raised at a time when patriotism was a really good thing, to be a patriotic American and a patriotic Jew. You know, I recall still growing up in the 1960s, the incredible pride of the world Jewish community, the American Jewish community, at the miraculous patriotic victory of the Jewish people in the '67 war. And I've witnessed in my own lifetime a radical transformation of these ideas among us as people and across the world. For example, when I was growing up, I think when many of the people who are watching this webinar today were growing up, there was little thought about a global community. There was very little experience with, we all knew people who were different, who weren't, Americans, or who weren't Jewish, if we were looking at that. But for the most part, we were separated, and the world was a much bigger place, and we were much smaller parts of it. And I think these terms are somewhat inaccurate and not useful any longer. And I want to just lift up what I'm thinking right now, especially right now, today, this week, when our nation is beginning yet another, and maybe I don't want to anticipate where you're going later, but we're beginning yet another self-examination of the failure of our society to embrace difference in our midst, with the awareness of a growing hatred towards Asian Americans now, and the tales of growing increases in anti-Semitism and growing increases in Islamophobia and growing racism against Black and other people of color in this country, and hatred of everything that's different. And I think that we at our own risk, we enter this conversation labeling things as patriotic, good, nationalist, not so good, ultra-nationalist, really not so good. But instead, we need to talk about hate, and we need to talk about acceptance. And we need to acknowledge that any of these movements, including patriotism, that leads us to hate others is bad. And I think there is bad patriotism. I'm not so sure if there's good nationalism. And I've struggled with this as a supporter of Israel ever since I became engaged with Israel. I'll stop there because I think I'm treading on future conversation today. So that's what I'm thinking about.
We just go have lunch now. It's good.
I appreciate what everyone has said, and I'm also really I'm struck by, on the one hand, I think language is incredibly important. And I think words have significant meanings. And I also think that there are times where we get caught up in the words where I don't always have the language for it, but there's things that we feel or there's things that we experience. And just to build off of what was already said, I think a significant part within this is, I think much of these terms are defined in the context of people with a singular or even a hybrid identity, right? So ultimately, even if we're going to talk about people who have chosen a new country, they've chosen a new country and they've then embraced that country. And I do agree. I mean, I think there's ways in which who gets to decide who's a patriot or who's a nationalist or who's in or who's out or who's a real member of that country raise huge problems. But I think fundamentally what we're talking about in the American Jewish community is a community that has deeply embraced our American identity and has participated profoundly in the American project, while simultaneously also having a deep love and appreciation of a foreign country that I would argue, right, and I don't know the actual statistics, right, but for most Americans, and I'll say for myself, I have no anticipation or expectation of becoming a citizen of, and so I think that I think we find ourselves at this odd crossroads, because I think we can argue ways in which there is this profound hatred that arises, right? What is it for people to look at? We'll use Asian Americans because of the horrific attacks that just happened this week, right? What is it for people to look at another group and decide they don't look American, whatever that means, right? But have a group to say, no, we are profoundly American. But then we have American Jews who say, no, we're profoundly American and can still also love another country. And I don't know that we have language for that.
So maybe by the end of this session, we might have some language for it. I'm not sure. And I think Rabbi Bennett has raised a very important issue and complicated it for us in a way that I think will be helpful for the discussion and debate, and at least for me, for my own personal processing, which I hope is what we're all doing individually, obviously as the facilitators, but also those 70 some odd folks who are with us on this call and those who will watch it later on. If it's okay, could we move to the next slide, and we'll try to move this forward. This could be the only time in the history of my ever teaching anything that I might get through the material that I've prepared. So I'm gonna have an opportunity maybe to think about it. Okay. Definition of nationalism. Nationalism entails loyalty for, devotion to, or identification with one's own nation and support for its interests. Well, such support involves a prioritization. I can't see it any longer because now it's too big. It's okay. I think everybody can read this, right? In addition, Daniel, I don't know how to, I can't read it all. Yes, entails loyalty.
I also just put it in the chat for you.
Perfect. Yeah. Such support involves the prioritization of some of these interests over the interests of those who do not belong to one's nation. In addition, nationalism involves the belief that the sovereign state is a morally legitimate, necessary political framework where members of citizens distribute to each other goods and purchase and pursue, protect, and cultivate their identity, values, and culture. Okay, that's the definition that I'm working with nationalism. Okay, now in and of itself, I know it's already been challenged, and I think that's an important way to start this conversation. But I want to try to see if we can march it forward, Dan. If we could go to the next. Thank you so much for doing this, by the way. You should be blessed and go directly to heaven when the time comes. Okay, so when I think about a sovereign nation, and there may be others who'd like to put in the chat other ideas, I think of the following pieces: citizenship, healthcare, education, and welfare. I wanted just to pause for a moment and ask the panelists who are with us and those who are listening to put in the chat, but those who are the panelists, is there anything else you might add to what a sovereign nation might prioritize as its ideal priorities, those things that have to rise to the, the highest part of the pantheon of our priorities? Any other pieces you want to share?
I don't like it, but I would say defense, self-defense.
Okay.
Might be something a sovereign nation prioritizes.
Right. We're seeing protection, defense coming through. Yeah. Others? Yeah.
If I can make a distinction, when you say a sovereign nation prioritizes, do you mean a sovereign state or do you mean a sovereign nation state? Or
it's a great question. Why don't you define it the way you want to define it? Yeah. And do me a favor, if you don't mind, maybe make a distinction between the way in which you think about it as an American and the way in which you think about it as an American Jew, in relationship to the state of Israel?
I see a state as a political entity, and a state can be a state with a nation or without a nation, right? I think one version of the American story tells it where we are essentially a state without a nation, right? The melting pot notion, whatever reality may or may not exist to it, is an image of a state without a nation, without a nationality, right? And then I think this is what American Jews have long meant when we've said that in America, there was no contradiction between being an American and being a Jew, which was saying that. Now, I think it might mean there's no contradiction between a white American and being a Jew, but I think that, right, that's different. Whereas a nation is your nationality. It is a group of people that you imagine a connection to, and that exists as your primary, right, usually ethno connection. That's the distinction I would make here. So, right, like a state can have all sorts of priorities that are different than a nation state. And it strikes me that a nation state's priorities are almost always to prioritize its nation over whatever minorities exist within the state. Yeah.
Gotcha. Okay. Rory, anything to add?
I'm gonna. There's a lot that Daniel just said that I have to sit with. I mean, I would like to imagine, although I also feel conflicted because these are the things that I want a state to prioritize, right? But not necessarily what states actually do prioritize, right? I'd like to think that states prioritize the welfare of all the people who are living within it, that they support vibrancy, strong economy, education or things like that. But by the way, I mean, like healthcare, education, those are things that people have had to fight for. I mean, I think fundamentally the first thing that Jim jumped in with, and a lot of people in the chat said, was national defense, which I actually think is probably like the first priority, right? Like you're not a state unless you have borders, and somebody has to define those borders. And then what happens within those is, right, you don't actually need the people to be happy living there to be a state.
Right. I'll just add also that Sister Carla May had an interesting comment, right? Rather than a nation as sovereign, we need to view people as sovereign. This allows borders to become more permeable. I get it. I mean, I really do. And I appreciate that. And I think on some level, maybe that's where Rabbi Bennett was going with part of what he has to say as well. But I think we're going to have to allow ourselves to be challenged by the reality, those of us who love and want for there to be a flourishing, successful Jewish state in Eretz Israel, right, and Medinat Israel. What does that mean? And I think that we're really getting to those issues now because, oh, look, somebody's coming on as me twice, because I think that's going to be the great challenge to this conversation that we're going to have to address.
Can I just add, though, I think we're failing to focus on the word sovereign as opposed to the word sovereign nation. I mean, sovereign, as I understand it, I'm sure there's a million definitions. Sovereign means supreme power, like I'm in charge. Nobody else gets to tell me. I'm autonomous and I make my own decisions and I'm kind of out here on my own. And I think my problem with this definition of these characteristics of a sovereign nation are that sovereign nations pretty much say, nobody's going to take care of us. We're going to take care of ourselves. And frankly, the implication is we don't have to really worry about anybody else. We want everybody else to be sovereign too. Yeah. And it leads us down a path where we're going to end up with a lot of sovereign nations and nobody's going to care about anybody else. Everybody take care of yourself and that's enough. And I think we see that in human behavior, individuals, the detriment to which we can focus on sovereignty. And I think we see it obviously in nations as well.
Fantastic. Good. You're leading us in great direction. So we added to that list. Let's go to the next slide if that's okay. This is good. This is working out really well. Like we almost planned it this way. Okay, fantastic. So I'm trying to make a distinction here between the notion of nationalism and fascism. Fascism embraces the exalting of one's nation, race, I lost it again, above others, and legitimizes the support for its interest to the exclusion and discrimination of all others, right? That is the definition of ultranationalism, right? Or what we're calling fascism here. I think all of us on this panel would agree that this is problematic for us. Yeah, I don't know about people in the chat, if there's anybody who disagrees. If so, please feel free to let any one of the panelists except me know. If you feel that, no, please feel free to let
there's another webinar going on for all those who are in favor of fascism.
So, but again, I can understand a kind of, let me say, fascism light that some might subscribe to. Not that I'm suggesting this, but I have encountered people of this sort in my own life experience, and maybe some of us have as well. And maybe often under the guise of, nobody else is going to care about us, so we have to care about ourselves, right? And this notion that if, im ein anili mili, right? If not for myself, right, who's going to be for me? Of course, forgetting the other side, if I'm only for myself, what am I? And I think that that's part of the conversation that we're going to need to have here. And I'm noticing some comments being raised here as well. Okay. I don't know exactly what's going on. We're having a little bit of a problem with the feed or something, but we'll try to move forward. Okay, I'm going to ask for the...
Carnie, if I can just dive in on that. I mean, I think it's... So I think part of what we have to grapple with in all of these questions is also the reality of human history, right? I mean, I think the problem is that for many groups, nobody else has cared, for many states. And I mean, and I think for the Jewish people, right? Nobody else did have our interests, and we've worked hard to advance our interests. And I grapple with that. I grapple with what does that mean today? Because I don't advocate for fascism. And I do think that the Jewish people have kind of a responsibility in terms of what are the ways that we can then help others. But I'm also aware of the fact that, while I think there's an idealism of, we want sovereignty and we want everyone to have sovereignty, and we don't need hard borders if everyone just kind of respected everyone else. And yet we also know that if we don't defend borders, there are wars, right? We even today, we still, countries invade other countries, and countries have occupied other territories. And right, all of these things are real. And so I have to, there's an ideal version of how I want people to live, but we have to deal with how people actually live. And so I'm naming that, saying that I don't like necessarily where I'm going with it, but I also can't ignore the history of how we got here.
So I'd love to frame this also around cosmopolitanism versus nationalism, which is one of the classic framings of nationalism, cosmopolitanism being sort of primary loyalty to the totality of humanity as opposed to your specific area. It's also worth saying that cosmopolitanism has often been an anti-Semitic code word. Our senator here in Missouri, Josh Hawley, 2 years ago at the Nationalism Conference, talked all about cosmopolitanism in a way that was rather anti-Semitically disturbing, I think. But I think one of the reasons that cosmopolitanism has been associated with Jews too is because for so long in Jewish history, so many of us have had a global perspective or a global network, and often been the only people in our regions who are operating within a global communications network in pre-modern days. And so this notion too, I think, is core to the Jewish experience. And I think this is probably part of the values divide between Israeli Jews and American Jews as well. That American Jews come with a long history, besides just being minority today, but of cosmopolitanism, and of seeing it as really kind of a value. I certainly love the idea of I'm a cosmopolitan, not a nationalist. But Israel's a nationalist movement. Zionism is a nationalist movement.
But, and I think, Carnie, a moment ago, you lifted up the potential solution for what Daniel just said, which is, Rabbi Hillel didn't say Amen Anili Mili, period. He said you can't be only sovereign, you can't be only nationalist. You have to also be, and I think we often forget that you have to also be for everyone. And the description you lifted a moment ago is infuriating to me when I hear Jews say, well, Jews have lived as the victims throughout our history, so if we got to take care of ourselves because nobody else is going to take care of us. Of course we have to take care of ourselves, but it doesn't end there. It doesn't.
For sure. Okay, we're going to move on to the next slide because I'm trying to take us in a particular kind of direction. Hopefully we'll be able to move there. So Reb Daniel, if you're able to help us, that's great. I can't see it, so I got to go to a different view. Okay, Very good. Okay, so national prioritization, right, must have boundaries. Nationalism cannot entail the complete and total exclusion and discrimination against all others who are not fellow citizens. To do so is to move from nationalism to ultranationalism, right? That's what I think we're saying here. That a nation at times differentiates and prioritizes its needs over those of others is self-evident. I think we understand that, right? There are moments in time when we must. Our moral intuitions legitimize such policies, just as we see it as self-evident that parents have greater moral responsibility to prioritize the needs of their own children. And I think that's a very powerful point. At least for me, it is a very powerful point. I care about all children, but to say that on some level I don't jaundice the needs of my own children over those of others, I think would be problematic. The act of prioritization is indispensable to most of our moral and political decisions. But this type of prioritization involves distinguishing between as distinct from discriminating against, right? Distinguishing between as opposed to discriminating against. The core question that we now face is not the question of legitimacy of encumberdness, but its consequences and its boundaries. And I want to get into this notion of what encumberdness means. We all know what it means to become unencumbered, but let's talk about for a moment the notion, if we go to the next slide, encumberdness, right? Next slide, very good. Jewish case for nationalism, the encumbered self, right? The notion that we are encumbered by certain kinds of things, right? And this is Michael Joseph Sandel, an American political philosopher, right? You can read his bio there. We are claimed by moral ties beyond universal humanity. And I know that challenges a little bit of what's been said here, but I can also see Rabbi Bennett at least shaking his head in the affirmative, though he raised the issue, to understand that what? My concern for the universal or for the particular doesn't mean I don't care about the universal or the particular. I care about both. But the question is, what do I do as a Jew, living as I do outside the land of Israel, but with deep, deep connections to the state and to its future? Encumbered self, therefore, duties you owe to a member group beyond universal humanity, moral obligations bound up with membership like family or city or nation. This is not prejudice or discrimination, at least not in my estimation. Being encumbered, feeling a special relationship to Am Yisrael, to the people of Israel, right? And I'll even go further to my congregation. I care about all congregations, but to my congregation, right? To my family is different than not giving a hoot about what happens to other people. Encumbered mean to be restricted or burdened. In Judaism, this does not carry a negative connotation. This is a chiyuv. We have the notion of chiyuv, of responsibilities and obligations. And in each of our denominations, we may do it differently. We may feel that it's from God that gives us the chiyuv. We may feel that it comes from our tradition. We may feel that it comes from ourselves, right? Each person chooses those things that encumber them. But when we talk about encumberness, people tend to talk about being, put upon. Judaism defines the essence of humanity and the foundation of human relationships through this notion of encumberness. We are ha-beha-talia. We are connected to one another, inextricably bound to one another. And to ignore that, I think, is to ignore one of the great lessons of Jewish tradition, and also to create for us a tension that at least I don't think I can live with, which is that I have to see the entire world cosmopolitan in the sense that, by the way, Daniel, sending us that article from the encyclopedia, right? And I think you memorized the whole thing, right? Which is, far more complicated and nuanced that we can do in this webinar. It's great, but I want to say that there are moments in time when I understand them, not moments, more and more often, those moments resonate within me that I am not unencumbered from the destiny of the people of Israel and also from the destiny of the people who are living in the land of Israel. So I want to pause for a moment and get some reflections from my colleagues who are here, please.
Well, go ahead, Rory. Go ahead.
Well, I do feel deeply encumbered. I feel deeply encumbered with the Jewish people, and I think it's really well said. And I think you're right. I do think that there's a sense of responsibility that comes first. But I don't think that we're exempt from thinking about the ways in which our encumberdness sometimes comes at the expense of other people, right? Or the responsibility that we have to ensure that that encumberness does not come at the expense of other people. And to use maybe like a silly example of it is, you know, I mean, everyone's talking about the anniversary of the start of the pandemic, right? And it was like, right, so like, sure, you have a responsibility to buy up water and toilet paper for your household, right? But what happens when suddenly other people don't have anymore? Right? Like there are times when we're talking about limited resources or where we are involved in some kind of zero sum where my obligation to my people harms somebody else. And I'm not saying that in those situations, you know, I'm not saying like, look, the ideal in that situation was if everyone had bought the same amount of toilet paper, we would have been fine, right? But in situations where we really are limited, I recognize the fact that I still might have an obligation to my family and I'm going to make sure that they have, but what am I encumbered by in recognizing that somebody is going without, right? So how do I make sure that I don't take more than what my family actually needs? And this becomes really complicated because how do any of us know when we have enough? But also, even if this is the bare minimum that my family needs, and even if I'm doing the right thing in giving to my family first, I still think that I am connected to and somehow still in relationship to and somehow responsible for the fact that somebody else is going to go without because I have.
By the way, I would say this is quintessentially Jewish, right? I feel the way I feel, but I'm guilty about the way in which I feel. Yeah.
I think it's more than guilt. I know you're joking, but I think it's more than guilt. And look, I think it's a beautiful construct and I think it's flawed. It reminds me of a politician recently who ran for office on the premise of making America great again, and that the premise of that was an encumberdness, that we as Americans are obligated only by our own encumberment, our own sense of obligation to ourselves. America first, encumberment first doesn't mean encumberment only. And I think that this becomes a circular justification for saying, of course, I'm responsible for the whole world, but somehow my responsibility as a Jew, as you framed it, or as he frames it, to be encumbered by Jewish need or Jewish relationship somehow gets me off the hook. It reminds me of that famous airplane instruction, you know, put your own mask on first before you help others, okay? It doesn't say put your own mask on first, period. And I think encumberment somehow becomes a failed justification. I want to see the rest of what he says in his argument. Does he say encumberment is enough? Is encumberment sufficient? The nation of Israel needs to protect the Jewish nation state for Jews, period? Or does it say the Jewish nation state has a responsibility for protecting the fate of Jews while simultaneously working actively to ensure the universal needs of humankind? I think it's a cop-out if we just say, oh, we as Jews are unique because we're encumbered. And does that let us off the hook? That's the question I have.
So I want to hold up something Mark Feldman said in a comment. I think it only came through to the panelists. But he talked about how we're looking with these terms, I think, to find a way to draw a line where the things that we like are kept within the circle and the things that we don't like are kept outside of the circle. So I want to push us to actually consider that the encumbered self is definitionally prejudiced and discriminatory, and that we just are accepting of living with that. That actually I am discriminating. I discriminate massively in terms of the kilowatt hours of energy that my family consumes as compared to the rest of the world, right? Like take the Paris Climate Accords, divide it up by the number of people, and I use 75 times as many kilowatt hours. And that's discrimination. I don't see it as such. I don't like to think of it as such, but it is. And I think when I feed my kids, Rory brought it out with the pandemic hoarding, right? But I think it's always the case. We may be okay with it. I'm certainly okay with prejudicing my own children above everyone else's children. But I think let's own at least that it is.
So for you, Daniel, naming it makes it easier to accept. Is that what I'm understanding?
Yeah, and understanding it not as a binary between acceptable prejudice and unacceptable prejudice, but understanding that prejudice and discrimination are built into all of these categories and that they need to be balanced. and that they aren't going away, right? Like this is the classic line about cosmopolitanism that, right, like it's great to love all of humanity, but your spouse may want you to love them more.
I mean, Daniel, I think you're right. And I agree with you. I mean, I think we need to kind of just name it. I think we do live in a world where we have these biases, but there still has to be limitations of it, right? I mean, I think even in, and I think, right, our kids are home today, right? So, right, but even in the example that you gave, right? So like, obviously you want to prioritize feeding your kids first, but I mean, I don't think any of us here would say that we could clear out the grocery store so that nobody else has food and, you know, that we're going to stockpile food for 3 years, right? So there's boundaries of it. And I think that's more the place that we need to talk about. Because I think every one of us is encumbered to somebody. I think the question is what do we prioritize, and like what are we willing to recognize as enough, and what are we willing to recognize as our boundaries? Because I also think that the people who engage in these discriminatory practices, right, like they feel deeply encumbered to their perception of a white American identity, of which they feel the need to prioritize that. They feel encumbered to others like it, and they feel willing to sacrifice other people for the sake of that identity. All of us do it, right? All of us prioritize and sacrifice. The question is can we talk about the morality of what it is we choose to prioritize, and can we talk about the limitations of how far can we go with it?
100%. I'm going to ask that we're going to go to two texts, which we're not going to comment on. We're really just going to read, okay? Because I think they're sort of self-evident when you read them. This will be these texts from Breshit, and there are two of them. One, of course, is well known to us, right? The Lord said to Cain, who just killed his brother Abel, and he said, where is your brother Abel? And I said, I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper, right? And of course, this is one of the great rhetorical questions of the Torah. Because the answer to that question is yes, you are your brother's keeper. And we know we have that obligation and responsibility. Part of the definition here, of course, which the Mefarshim, the commentators get into up to this day, right, is what does my brother mean, right? What does your brother mean? How far does that go? I want to suggest, as we initially read this text, and this is something, of course, that many of us learned at Hartman, that the Torah goes from this very, very, very general reality to a more specific reality. It starts universal and funnels down into the particularistic, and then hopes for some point to go back to the universal, right? The return to the reality of an expansive world that includes everybody. But I think this is a very interesting question and a very interesting text, which we could spend more time than we have today trying to unpack. But I wanted to start there to ask that question, am I my brother's keeper? And then how do we each define my brother? If we had more time, we could spend time, my brother, my sister, my sibling, right? What does that mean? But I want to jump to the next text, which is an interesting one, right? This is the one of what? God says, shall I hide from Abraham what I'm about to do, which is the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, right? And then, of course, we have the whole negotiation, right? Up to the point where if there are 10 tzaddikim, there are 10 righteous people, I'll save the land, right? But look at the bottom line. Far be it from you, right? saying to God, right? The audacity, the chutzpah saying to God, right? Will you do such a thing to bring to death upon the innocent as well as the guilty, so that the innocent and guilty are fair alike? In other words, they come out the same, right? Hashofet kol haaretz lo yaseh mishpat. Shall not the judge of all the earth deal justly? In other words, we're dealing with a God who challenges us to do justly, not just with our brothers, not with those we feel close to, not only those that we're connected to, those we're encumbered with, but aren't we also responsible for everybody? Isn't that the ultimate goal of our tradition? So let's go on to the next slide, if it's okay. Daniel, you're doing such a great job. I could never do this, right? So here's Benedict Anderson, right? The fellow members of even the smallest nation will never know most of their fellow members, meet them, or even hear of them, yet in the minds of each lives the image of the communion. We're connected to one another. We know each other. The locus of criticism against nationalism is found in the question of prioritization of national interests over the interests of others. To respond to this criticism, I just lost the text because Daniel, your screen popped up. It is essential to define national interests. So let's go to the next line. What are national interests, right? And I want to now move to something that I think some of you have already alluded to, but this is the language that I'd like to use. I want to talk about menschlich nationalism. In other words, recognizing, of course, that we make priorities within a nation. But self-interest has many meanings: physical safety and prosperity, spiritual and moral aspiration, sacrifice for a greater purpose. Let's go on to the next slide, right? I want to introduce this notion of menschlich nationalism that is done in a way that takes into consideration all people, to hold in heart and mind simultaneously that, yes, I'm encumbered by my relationship to the Jewish people and to the state of Israel, but simultaneously, lo alecha hamlacha ligmor, right? It's not up to us to finish the work, but we're also not free and not absolved of our responsibility to aspire towards making the world that we want. And so we're going to live with that tension, with that guilt, with that sense of a divided heart that, yes, I worry about my own people, right? Here and there, I worry about the people of my community in a way that I don't necessarily worry about the entire world, but I don't ignore the world that's out there. But here's the challenge, and here's my question. This is Herzl, right? This is Theodor Herzl saying this is a Jewish state in 1896. Is there such a thing as necessary nationalism? Somebody alluded to this, that maybe at one point in time this was the case. But this, and I would say that for many of the people that I encountered, I'll have you guys comment on this just a moment, is there still a necessary nationalism? We have sincerely tried, Herzl says, everywhere to merge with the national communities in which we live, seeking only to preserve the faith of our fathers. It is not permitted. It is not permitted us, right? It hasn't been available to us. In vain are we loyal patriots, sometimes super loyal, right? Think about the experience that Herzl is talking about, right? Think of the Dreyfus affair. In vain, we do not make the same sacrifices of life and property as our fellow citizens. In vain, do we strive to enhance the fame of our native lands in the arts and sciences, or her wealth by trade and commerce. In our native lands, where we have lived for centuries, we are still decried as aliens, often by men whose ancestors have not come yet at a time when Jewish sighs had long been heard in the country. Let me repeat once more my opening words. The Jews who will it shall achieve their state. We shall live at last as free men on our own soil, and in our own homes peacefully die. The world will be liberated by our freedom, enriched by our wealth, magnified by our greatness, and whatever we attempt there for our own benefit will redound mightily and beneficially the good of all mankind. Herzl's claim here is that what? Then there is a necessary nationalism that comes maybe from the need for us to have our own place as a safe haven, as a place to protect ourselves, as a place to cultivate that which we need to be the unique Jewish people that can then go out in the world and make a difference. And so I want to just lay out on the table and maybe get some reactions to this notion. Do we still buy this notion? Do we believe that we need to be menschlich nationalists potentially out of necessity? Does that still resonate for you? And in what ways? And again, I think we all would agree that if there is going to be any kind of nationalism, and I'm not sure we agree that that's important at all, but it has to be some combination of surely menschlich, but also a necessity. There has to be something about the Zionist project that is value added, not just to the Jewish people, but to the world at large. So reactions, please.
I mean, I'll begin. Thank you. I think it's really beautiful the way you've laid this out, Carnie, and I'm grateful on behalf of all of us. I want to just start my reaction by saying this is not 1896, and the Jewish world is not anything like the Jewish world was in 1896. Do we need menschlich nationalism? If we're going to have mentionalism, it must be menschlich, for sure. Do the Jewish people need that kind of prioritization of our own needs over all others? I would argue no. I would argue, yes, there are anti-Semitic moments and incidents in the world. Yes, there are Jews who are the victims of deep-seated prejudices, but I don't think that argument, that construct that is a justification for Jewish ultranationalism or even Jewish nationalism is an effective or legitimate one any longer in 2021. I don't think that we can begin the conversation there. I do believe we have the right to identify with others who share our faith, who share our national heritage, who share our ethnicity. We do have the right to identify. Everybody has. But I believe we need a different construct. We need a state that is first moral, first universal, and only if we achieve that, then it can be a national state. And that's the aspiration for a Jewish state and for an America that I still believe in working for.
You know, I'm struck by how much of this is really just talking about realism, right? Like the model that we deal with is nation states. That was certainly the model when Israel emerged, but building off of and sort of tangenting off of Jim, you know, one of the things that's happening here is Israel is amongst the very last nation states to emerge, and we are moving towards a post-nation state moment today, right? Like the refugee crisis that's happening, the migration crisis that's happening across the world is remaking what nationalism means, right? And what loyalty means in all of these places. So I don't know, I'm struck that sometimes I think we re-argue old arguments also to talk realism in a different way. Like we have these conversations as if it matters whether or not we think nationalism is good or bad in terms of whether or not Israel is created, because Israel is not an idea that's going to be created. Israel is, right? Like, and it is a nation state. It is an ethno-nation state of the Jewish people, right? At times an ultra-nationalist state of the Jewish people, or at least certainly there are components of the politics there, just like there are here. So I don't know, I think sometimes we get stuck in these old conversations, like, was it legitimate for Israel to be founded? Who cares? Right? Israel was founded. It existed. By the way, I think it was legitimate. I think from the same realism critique that we're dealing with here, I think it required it at some level.
I think everything that's been said is just incredibly profound. And, you know, I mean, I think that this is really the crux of what it is that we wrestle with as American Jews, because I think so much of what in my own education, so much of what's been given to me is this, you know, everyone had a state, so Jews needed a state also, right? Or like kind of this idea of nationalism, or and I think we don't have to go back and undo all of that, but I think really what I hear you pushing us towards in this, Carnie, which I'm so deeply grateful for, is how do we reflect on this so that we can actually come up with this language for what it means for us today, right? Like I don't think that the language, I mean, look, I think I'm deeply grateful to Herzl and all of the work that he did and the language that he brought about. I'm also very much aware that Herzl was one of many thinkers on this, and the Zionism that we have today is not exclusively a Herzl Zionism. But I also think that any Zionism that exists today can't be the Zionism of 1896, right? Like that I think that sometimes the flaw in our Jewish community is that we repeat the same tropes over and over again. And we talk about, you know, what people were saying in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s and the 1890s and the 1700s, right? When really what we need to be saying is what, right? At the end of the day, I don't need to be in relationship to Israel, right? Like this is a personal choice. This is not, you know, this might have been very different for our ancestors, but to live in America in 2021 is not to have to feel encumbered by Israel. And so that's ultimately a choice for me of what is it for me to, who do I choose to be encumbered by? What does it mean for me to be encumbered? And then what does that demand of me? And I think that what you're challenging us all to is to say, like, we can't just use, you know, it's not just like Jewish nationalism is a valid movement or not a valid or whatever. It's, these are things that have to be redefined. And even if we were the people who were fighting years ago for it, we would still need to redefine it for 2021. Yeah. And that's something that we have to do as individuals. Every one of us has to do that.
Rory, I think you speak great wisdom, and I too am grateful for you, Carnie, bringing this topic to the forefront here. You know, I want to shout out to also the generational nature of this conversation. While I know there are younger people who are drawn to a more nationalist ideology, I think by and large, the generation that is emerging and will be in charge of the next generation and the next and the next, are increasingly drawn to new terminologies and new boundaries of these issues. And what we may be witnessing, quite frankly, is the death throes of nationalism and ultranationalism, and what feels right now like an overwhelming rise of nationalism, both nationally, both here in the United States and across the globe, actually may be the opposite. It may be the last gasps of those old models of nationalist identity and definitions of nationhood. And I really believe that the next generations are overwhelmingly inclined towards what I personally long for, which is a unencumbered universalism. And, I posted this in the chat. I just want to point out that most of the most severe problems that face us as human beings today are not nationalist problems. This global pandemic for the last 13 months has proven that. The great challenge of climate destruction and the destruction of our environment, those are not nationalist problems. And we fool ourselves when we think we can hide in our little nationalist identities and protect ourselves and everything will be okay. Because as we are doing that, as we're allowing that, our planet is being destroyed.
So
Really, really wonderful pieces. Dan, you want to jump in again, please?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I really appreciate what you said, particularly I think in an American context. We almost take it for granted that each generation is more progressive. I want to hold on to the fact that actually, if you look at every generation of Israeli Jews, every generation has been more ultra-religious, more fundamentalist, more conservative, more nationalist than the generation before it. And so the most right-wing, theocratic-leaning Jewish nationalist in the negative senses of that ultra-Jewish nationalist generation are the youngest Israelis, not the oldest.
And maybe that's a good place for me to jump in here on this issue, because I want to say a couple of things. First of all, it strikes me that all of us who are sitting around this conversation, unlike many of the people in the chat, are obviously post-Holocaust folks and post the establishment of the State of Israel folks. And I think that was raised already, but I want to reinforce that concept, that I have that very strong sense that it's a distinguishing factor for many of us. Not that they're wrong and we're right. It may be that it's true that new models are emerging. I would just say for myself that I remember, since we're talking Hartman here, I remember when Rabbi Hartman, the Zichrono Livracha, the elder statesman of the Hartman Institute, got up, and I think I may have mentioned this before in these conversations. He was talking about what the state of Israel needs to be and what the state of Israel needs not be. And he started to criticize, and he often had notes in front of him, but he often went off script. And he spoke extemporaneously, and he was filled with, kind of emotion, and he started to tear up and cry. And he said, if this is what the state of Israel is going to be, then we don't need this project. It's a project that's failed. So the question becomes, I, at least personally, still feel very connected to the notion of encumberedness. And I don't feel badly about being encumbered. But my encumberdness is not about particularism. It really is about the notion of reading Jewish tradition, at least as I do, and I think many of us do. The ultimate goal of Judaism, right, is to make letaken olam b'malchut Shaddai. It's to make the entire world a better place. And if that's the case, we have to find a way in which to remain at least somewhat encumbered to the tradition. I don't want to become untethered, right? I don't think anybody on this, we're rabbis for God's sakes, right? We're not becoming untethered from Jewish tradition, because I see that in the, in the chat here. Like, if we let it go, it's all over, right? Like, that's not what we're saying. We're talking about the natural evolution of the way in which a tradition, or maybe not so natural, maybe it's a little bit less natural than I want it to be, of an evolution of a tradition that will see itself returning to what? To where the world started. There were no distinctions of these sort. It was a Gan Eden reality, right? And Gan Eden itself couldn't exist, but maybe we can return to a notion of a universalism, that we are all created in the image of God, and that we're all responsible to live in a way that's reflective of that. And so we move in whatever ways we move towards that aspirationally. but we never actually get there, right? That asymptotal striving of people to get to something. For me, that's a profound element of this. But I would say that I'm still very much encumbered by the notion of encumberdness. I think it's a great language, and I love the notion of menschliche nationalism, because I don't believe that in this reality, right? Mashiach Zeit isn't here yet, and I want to get there, and I know Rabbi Bennett would like to take us there faster. He's yelling, "We want Mashiach now," right? We want Mashiach Zeit now, but I think we have a long way to go before we get to that place. And I don't want to give up on the dream. I don't want to give up on the end game. But I do want to say that there need to be steps that we need to take here and there. And as we take them here, we need to influence there, but also know that our influence there is going to be limited, and that, that's the cross-fertilization of these two great Jewish communities. We have things to teach one another, and we need to share that idea, as opposed to moving unidirectionally, only from one to the other. So, at least for me, and then our friends each maybe have a parting shot. Maybe I'll go first, and then we'll kind of go out. First of all, people, please read the chat. There's so much that's being said that's so beautiful, and so many questions. And
no one else can see the chat. It only goes to us.
It's so wonderful. It's so wonderful. But what I want to throw out there.
Then we can send it to everyone else. Rather, if people, we don't have it next week, so oh well.
Okay, but I want to say this: we should have another time where we simply have a chance to answer questions and maybe put up the chats and go through them and reflect them, because I think that would be a great service to our Jewish community. Second thing I want to say is that this is not the last time the four of us are going to get together and teach Hartman Torah. We're already hearing that this can't be the end, where people are crying here, like it's like Eicha over here instead of the chat. People are crying, and I love these people and I want to be with them more often, which is great. But the last thing I want to say is that we're all in slightly different places in all of this, right? And that's wonderful. And what's so exciting to me about this is that four serious Jewish leaders care so deeply about what's happening here and there. We could easily say, forget that enterprise, give up on that enterprise. That was the part that impressed me so much about when Rabbi Hartman started to cry, right? He started to cry, right? Not because he was ready to give up, but simply he was looking at a slice. He was looking at a moment in time and saying, we have not yet arrived at the time that we want to arrive. And so each in our own way, I want to bless us that we're able to kind of do the work that we need to do to get us there. And it won't be in lockstep with one another, right? But we will know that we are along a journey, and some are a little further ahead, some are a little behind, and some are consciously ahead, and some are consciously behind. But that's okay too. We're all kind of in the process of aspiring. So that's my last 2 cents, and we'll go around it.
I don't know if there's anything more to add. I think that was just such a beautiful closing. But since you all offered, well, I'll jump in with something, I guess. But I'm struck in the conversation, and some of the conversation also in the chat, by I think like the ways in which, and I talked about kind of wrestling with the history and how we've gotten here and the reality and all of those things. But what I am so deeply grateful for, Carnie, is that I think you've really pushed us to imagine what's an ideal. And I think in that, like, we might have different ideals. I don't actually know that I'm as much of a universalist as Jim might be. Like, I don't know, right? I mean, I think there's definitely gradations within it, but I think what you've pushed us to is to say, who do we want to be, right? I keep going back to, like, you guys started before with the Rabbi Hillel quote, and right, and so it's right, but like uchshani latzmi ma ani, right? Like, when I'm only for myself, what am I? But I think it's such a profound question, right? What am I? Like, who, and like that to drive us forward, right? Like, who do we want to be, and then how do we build a world in which we can strive for that? And so it's not about being reactionary to others or what they're doing. It's not about, I need a nation state because everyone has a nation state. It's about, what do I actually want the world to look like? And that's such a beautiful place, I think, for us to go in this conversation, and for all of us in our lives, right? That should always be the driving force, not what have I been told, and not what do I feel pulled to, and not what are people telling me to do, and not what do I feel forced to, but what do I actually dream of? And if we could get to a place where all of us, even to your point, even if we're going in different ways, if it's actually coming out of a place of an ideal that we can all imagine, I think that all of us could live in a far better world for it.
Yeah, I agree. And Rabbi Hillel also said, if not now, when? And so, Carnie, to your point that I sound impatient and that I want us to be there, I am impatient. I believe that if we keep deferring our aspirations and justifying that by, reality somehow, well, realpolitik demands that I put aside my aspirations, we will never get to our aspirations. I was thinking about, I love my home and my yard. Not right now because it's kind of dismal after the winter, but and I put in a lot of work. My wife and I put in a lot of work to plant flowers and to have a nice yard. But when a tree falls on my neighbor's yard right next to me, or from my yard onto my neighbor's yard, or from his yard onto my yard, I think that's not just his or my responsibility, it's our responsibility. And I want the next person beyond my neighborhood, in the next neighborhood, to also have a nice place to live and to be safe and to be secure. And I can't satisfy myself to just simply live in my own secure environment and not think about the rest of the world. I don't want to live in that world. I don't want to live in a world where each of us is taking care only of ourselves. And so I think this conversation for us as Jews compels us to force ourselves to have one foot in each world. We do, of course, we have to care about ourselves, each of us, but we simultaneously have to be caring for and partnering with and reaching out to and even inconveniencing ourselves often and limiting our own needs regularly in order to assure that everyone's needs are cared for. And if we don't do that now, we will never do that. And so that's where my impatience comes from, because I think it's a cop-out ultimately.
So thank you, all three of you, Carnie for today in particular, but certainly Rory and Jim for all of these sessions. I know I have certainly been pushed and grown. I think I've said all of my words that I have about nationalism. So I do sort of have a reflection on this whole thing that we've done, which is that I think writ large, one of the things that I love about this is I think I froze. Oh, nope, I'm back. You all froze, not me. One of the things that I think
you really are unencumbered. It's great.
One of the things that I think we're seeing and hopefully demonstrating is American Jewry stepping up in a self-confident way to say, this is who we are and this is what our Judaism is, and that's different than Israel, and it's not inferior to Israel, and it's not like only in relationship to Israel. But in fact, right, like this was the very first session, and we talked about doing a final session called From No Home to Two Homes. And it really strikes me that I have a lot of confidence in American Jewry walking away from these sessions, that we are standing up and we are articulating a Judaism that is self-confident and built for us, rather than afraid of being seen as lesser than Israeli notions of what Jewish identity is. So thank you all.
Beautiful. I just want to add, because one of my own congregants said it to me, so I'm gonna just add it here, and it's somebody I love very much, and many of us love. I don't think any of us are saying, as the chat suggested, that we are abandoning Jewish tradition and becoming some kind of universalist or some kind of integral spiritualist, right? We're not talking about that. None of us are talking about that. I think we're coming from the place of, this is what the deepest Torah within us. In fact, the deepest Torah itself, Reb Zalman used to say, search your heart, you'll find the Torah. Search the Torah, you'll find your heart. The deepest Torah is the Torah that we're trying to share right now. And it's around these issues that we're going to discover our deepest Torah. And none of us here is saying that we've nailed it. So someone was upset that Rabbi Bennett it wasn't challenging me, he's challenging an idea, right? And he's along the way. We're all on the same road. We're all doing this holy work together. So we're not talking about, taking off all of the trappings of Jewish tradition. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about digging deep, deep, deep into this fertile soil called Jewish tradition and trying to figure out, what does the Holy Blessed One really want from us as Jews, as human beings, as people inhabiting this planet together. And the last thing I will say just on this is that, Rabbi Bennett, you are an outstanding neighbor. And anytime trees have fallen, you're the first one out there to take care of them.
As are you.
And your dog never crosses and does anything on my yard, so it's fantastic. But really, you are a fantastic neighbor, and you're all great neighbors, and we should all be great neighbors to one another. But I thank you for the holy work that each of you is doing in this vineyard. It's really important, and I don't want us to forget that, and I want people in the chat to think otherwise. What we're doing here is l'shem shamayim, right? Machloket l'shem shamayim, discussing and debating, and sometimes disagreeing, and sometimes learning, hopefully, right, from the chelek, the part of the great truth that we own, right, or that we think we own, or that we've discovered, and sharing it with others. So let us have many more opportunities to do this. We're getting, when's the next one? So we'll have to let you know. Thank you all.
Amen. Thank you, Carnie.
Amen.